But here's Hillary Clinton, for example. Again, going back to the speech wasn't divisive. The gaslighting the Democrats do is truly mind-blowing. She says that Biden did a, quote, very important service to the country when he was calling out Republican fascists. Play 12.
I think he did a very important service to the country in giving the speech that he gave, because too many people are not yet aware of how fragile our democracy is. And I'm not going to second guess the language he used because there has been so much that has gone beyond anything I ever would have dreamed of, starting with January 6th. But so many threats of violence and concerns that people are expressing about the country, coming apart and all of that. So I think he did a real service, and I personally thought it was a strong and necessary speech. And I would not second guess any of the language.
Clay. I mean, this is the kind of stuff they say. Let's also remind everybody, which is the party? I mean, is it Biden voters or Trump voters who commit most riots, who commit 90% of riots, 95% of riots? But the narrative has shifted all because of January 6th.
Well, and let's talk about what we began the show discussing. The murder rate in Memphis, the murder rate all over this country. The people who are committing murders are not Republican voters by an overwhelming majority. In fact, I doubt whether very many of the people who are committing murders vote at all. But the American public demands now. I think this is a crucible moment. There are three things that every single Republican candidate should be slamming every day. Crime is out of control in this country. The border is an unmitigated disaster. And inflation is at a 40-year high. And, Buck, I thought this clip, which we didn't play in the open, really kind of personifies what soft on crime means. We talked about Eliza Fletcher, 34-year-old mother of two who was killed on a jog. Now we've got a kid, 19-year-old, relatively young, out streaming himself live on Facebook as he murdered 4 people in Memphis. Eliza Fletcher was killed by a guy who should have still been behind bars if he had been serving out his whole violent prison sentence. And this killer, who was driving around in Memphis live streaming his murders, also would have still been in prison. I want to play cut 17 here for you because this is where Republicans should be. Overwhelming majorities of the country right now feel like they are in danger when they walk outside of their door because our cities, states, and even rural areas are becoming killing fields because we're not keeping violent criminals behind bars and because we are not giving police the authority to take care of them. If anybody wants to be outraged, and if there's any threat to our democracy, it's actually the threat that is existential in so many of our lives right now to deal with crime. Listen to this Memphis mayor.
If Mr. Kelly served his full 3-year sentence, he would still be in prison today, and 4 of our fellow citizens would still be alive.
That's the mayor of Memphis, Buck. And this is the storyline here overwhelmingly by numbers. The people who are committing violent crimes, almost every single one of them, if you go look at their history of violent crime, they would still be in prison if we were actually enforcing the laws adequately in this country.
And now the American people have an opportunity to hold the Democrats accountable for the policies of defunding police, ending mass incarceration, all of this, the Soros prosecutors. If it doesn't happen, they'll just continue. And it's fascinating to hear how, well, first of all, as we know, because of who the perpetrator is in Memphis, there'll be a lot less discussion about gun control from the media. He doesn't fit the profile of the gun control discussion. So this story, I think, unfortunately, the one about the live stream shooter is likely to vanish in the media narrative very quickly. Eliza Fletcher, that stays with people. That's not one that anybody is going to forget because of the heinous nature of the crime and the fact that this is an individual who was just a career criminal. I mean, a threat to public safety. If he's not going to be locked up, if he's not going to suffer the full consequences of his actions for previous crimes. I know he faces the death penalty now, and as we all know, even if he gets the death penalty, it'll take 30 years before they actually will execute that sentence. But the reality is they've pushed these policies and ideas because it makes Democrats feel better about themselves. The ones who are in positions of authority to push these ideas overwhelmingly don't live in unsafe neighborhoods, and they view the effort to achieve greater social justice. This is just straight out of the left-wing playbook. This is right out of their ideology. The effort to achieve social justice means that there's just going to be more murders, more assaults, more rapes, more burglaries, more carjackings. That is the price we as a society must pay. That's the part of it they don't talk about. But if you look at the true left-wing reformers of the criminal justice system, Clay, they don't even talk about just defunding police. They talk about abolition of police, and they use that word for very obvious purposes. Getting rid of armed agents of the state to prevent people from doing heinous things to their fellow citizens, their fellow human beings. That's how crazy the left-wing anti-cop, anti-law enforcement movement really is. And Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden and all the rest of the Democrat power apparatus went along with it when it was in their political favor to do so, and now are muted at best in their willingness to criticize this and be honest about it. They're just hoping that people forget. Our job is to make sure no one forgets.
And to not forget that violent criminals should be behind bars. And when they're not behind bars, they behave as violent criminals. This kid, 19-year-old, I keep saying kid because he's so young, they knew that he was attempted first-degree murder charges were against him. They dropped it to give him 3 years in prison. He didn't even serve the 3 years, Buck. This happens every time. Almost every time you see a violent act in any of your cities, go look up what the history is of that individual. I mean, even out of Canada, those people who stabbed 10 people to death, one of those guys had been arrested 51 times, Buck. I mean, we know who the bad guys is. How often do you hear when a major incident occurs, the FBI says what? He was on our radar.
Yep.
Almost every time he's on our radar. Our authorities know the bad guys.
Now, it's one thing when you have somebody who let's say a terrorist, ideological crime, sometimes they're on the radar, but they hadn't actually committed a previously violent act. What we're talking about here are clear career criminals that are a threat to public safety and the most obvious, a demonstrated, historical, proven threat to public safety, and they are let out. Why? Because a lot of politicians wanted to pat themselves on the back and wanted to get a high five from the media for ending mass incarceration or lowering mass incarceration. We are suffering. We're having to learn the same lessons, learn the lessons of decades past, where being soft on criminals resulted in a lot of people being victimized.
Unfortunately, that's exactly right. Well, and let's talk about what we began the show discussing. The murder rate in Memphis. The murder rate all over this country. The people who are committing murders are not Republican voters by an overwhelming majority. In fact, I doubt whether very many of the people who are committing murders vote at all. Eliza Fletcher was killed by a guy who should have still been behind bars if he had been serving out his whole violent prison sentence. And this killer, who was driving around in Memphis live streaming his murders, also would have still been in prison. I want to play cut 7.
And now a response to a lunatic named Chris Schwartz up there in Black Hawk County, Iowa. I'll reiterate again. Here's the real Democrat insurrection. 1, take away everybody's guns, even from law-abiding citizens like myself. In uber-white rural areas of Iowa. Take those guns away. Number 2, if someone like Kyle Rittenhouse comes along, and I don't like the terms left-wing or right-wing, but I'll use left-wing so everybody will know what I'm talking about. When someone like Kyle Rittenhouse comes along, when left-wing lunatics are trying to burn down your city and does something about it, they want to put him in jail for murder. 3, they want to defund and or intimidate the police into the Ferguson Effect, where they don't go into high crime areas and do any proactive policing, which means people are more likely to have violent crimes happen to them, and it's more likely that they won't be solved because the police will not be there anytime soon. And then the other facet of that is to let violent criminals loose. Now, Chrissy says we're not safe anywhere. That's false. In any given year, and it's gone down a little bit over the past decade, but in any given year, about 50% of counties in the U.S. have no homicides. There is no gun violence or violence epidemic among hood rats burning places down and killing people indiscriminately in western Iowa. In most of Montana, there is no gun violence or homicide or violence epidemic. The two counties in Montana that have collectively a homicide average over a long period close to the U.S. average were two Democrat counties. The pro-Trump counties had a homicide rate that barely registered. Most of Missouri does not have a problem with homicide. It's St. Louis City and Kansas City. In the uber-white, uber-Trump counties of Missouri, the homicide rate is lower than the Missouri average, lower than the national average, and certainly lower than St. Louis and Kansas City. The same goes for Texas. The same goes for Florida, and I've looked all these up. In Georgia, the most homicide-laden areas of Georgia that are pulling the homicide rate their way up are Democrat counties. The uber-white, uber-Trump counties aren't doing that. Tennessee is another perfect example of that. And Clay and Buck were talking about Tennessee. They've spent a lot of time talking about Shelby and Davidson counties, which last time I didn't include Memphis. See the links in the video description. I have all this outlined for everybody. We're going to keep beating the drum. Shelby and Davidson, I had Memphis in the queue there, but I didn't have Nashville. Next time I will put them in. But Tennessee's homicide rate is spiked because of Shelby and Davidson counties. That's where Nashville and Memphis are. Outside of those counties, the homicide rate is very low. There is not a violence or gun violence epidemic or homicide epidemic in most of New York. There is not a homicide epidemic or gun violence epidemic in most of Minnesota. Now, in the Twin Cities, there are. But in the uber-white, uber-Trump counties of Minnesota, guess what? The homicide rate barely registers. So, this idiot's claim that we're not safe anywhere, he's trying to facilitate hysteria. He's projecting the violent urges of Democrat voters, because you'll see that in any state, and here's a challenge for you, Chris, and I'm going to challenge you to this on your Facebook too, just in case you don't get this, and we're going to have it out on this. We'll see how well you do. Find me any state, and don't worry, I have the answer key. I have plenty of info for you that I looked up. I even dumbed it down for an idiot like yourself. Find me any state where the whitest pro-Trump counties or the most pro-Trump counties have a homicide rate higher than the state average, higher than the national average, and higher than the pro-Biden / pro-Hillary counties. See what you come up with, buddy. So his claim, that we're not safe anywhere is a lie. You'll look through my data and you'll see young black men are disproportionately, very disproportionately victims of homicide, and blacks are disproportionately arrested for violent crime and homicide. And this is happening in Democrat-run cities. In my last time I examined all these cities, and I'll do it again in 2023, so it'll probably have it out in the summer of 24. All those Democrat cities, and I've even got data proving they elect Democrats on their Senate districts and House districts too, not just who they voted for president. And if you wanted to, you could go to Dave Leap's website, and if it's a county, you could look up how they voted for their Democrat governor and candidate and Democrat Senate candidates and whatnot. But you'll see those cities had a homicide rate several times the national average. They're all Democrat enclaves. So again, we're not safe anywhere. No, you're projecting. I should also mention, when's he going to call? I haven't seen him call out. He says Black Lives Matter. Do the black lives that are abandoned by young black men to be raised alone, do those black lives matter? What about the black lives that are extinguishing other black lives in gangland homicides in places like Chicago, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Detroit, Camden, and Wilmington? What about those black lives? I haven't seen him call out the out-of-wedlock birth rate. That's spiked massively in this country over the last 70 years, especially among blacks. Chris, when are you going to call out young black men for abandoning their children? So, again, he's really wrong on this. He has no idea what he's talking about, and that's why he does short Facebook posts and memes and crap. And it's the same crap here. Oh, anytime a homicide occurs, oh my gosh, if it saves just one life. No, Chris, it's your voters that are perpetrating most of the violence in this country in counties and cities that are run by your party. So I should tell you to let's lighten up on the Freudian projection, okay, old man? Have a nice day, and don't thank me now for the information.